For the first time in over 40 years, the United States Marines rolled out a brand new combat vehicle. It happened in November 2020, quietly at first, but history was being rewritten. This wasn't just another armored truck. It was a machine designed to fight on both land and sea. The Amphibious Combat Vehicle, or ACV, marked the end of an old era. The Corps' trusted but aging AAV-7s had been permanently banned from the water in 2021, after a tragic sinking claimed young Marine lives. For Marines, this was never just about machines. It was about survival. Every squad needed a vehicle that could launch from a ship, swim through surf, and still fight once it hit the beach. The stakes were brutal. Could any vehicle do it all? Swim through crashing waves, survive roadside IEDs, defeat enemy drones, and plug directly into the modern digital battlefield? The ACV promised all of it, wrapped in a design built for the next war. And when the world finally saw it in action, the reaction was shock. This is the story of the US Marines' new combat vehicle, the ACV, and why it shocked the world. For nearly 5 decades, one vehicle carried the weight of the United States Marines. The AAV-7, first fielded in the 1970s, was the Corps' armored workhorse. It launched from Navy ships, churned through rough surf, and delivered Marines straight into the fight. For generations, it was more than steel. It was part of Marine identity. But by 2020, that legacy was showing fatal cracks. On July 30th, 2020, during a training exercise off the coast of California, disaster struck. An AAV-7 carrying 16 troops began taking on water. Within minutes, it was sinking beneath the waves. Rescue attempts came too late. 9 Marines and 1 sailor were lost. The images of that day burned into the Corps' collective memory. Families wept. Brothers in arms stood in stunned silence. And leaders faced an undeniable truth. The old warhorse could no longer be trusted. Investigations revealed corrosion, poor maintenance, and outdated designs. The AAV-7 had simply reached the end of its life. The tragedy forced a permanent ban. By 2021, the Marines' once proud amphibious assault vehicle was barred from the water forever. For Marines, the betrayal was personal. The machine meant to save lives had taken them instead. Families demanded answers. Congress demanded change. And the Corps was left with an impossible question. If the AAV-7 was dead, what could take its place? What new vehicle could launch from sea, swim through surf, fight on land, and keep Marines alive under 21st century fire? The answer would not be simple. It would take years of trials, billions in funding, and a complete rebirth of amphibious warfare. The Marines needed a new champion, and its name would be the ACV. The death of the AAV-7 left the Marines with no amphibious trust. But even before the 2020 tragedy, the search for a replacement had already begun. In 2018, the US Marine Corps awarded the contract to BAE Systems and its Italian partner, Iveco. The mission was clear: build a vehicle that could swim, fight, and survive the wars of tomorrow. The result was the Amphibious Combat Vehicle, or ACV. From the outside, it looked like another armored box on tracks, but inside, it was a rebirth of Marine doctrine. The first variant, the ACVP, was designed to carry a full 13 Marine squad, plus a crew of 3. It rolled on massive wheels instead of tracks, giving it speed and stability. A V-shaped hull shielded troops from roadside bombs. Blast-absorbing seats replaced the deadly flat benches of the old AAV-7. On November 13, 2020, the Corps declared it had reached initial operational capability, its first new amphibious vehicle in over 40 years. For Marines, the moment carried weight. This wasn't just steel, it was survival delivered on 6 rugged tires. But there was a twist. The ACV wasn't just a troop carrier, it was built as a digital war machine. Its systems plugged directly into the Marine Corps' networked battle command. It could share targeting data, track drones, and feed information across the digital battlefield. For the first time, Marines weren't just passengers, they were connected nodes in a larger warfighting web. A new era had begun, but questions still loomed. Could this futuristic vehicle handle real waves, real fire, and real combat chaos? Or would the promise of the ACV collapse under its first true tests? The promise of the amphibious combat vehicle was bold: swim through waves, storm beaches, and keep Marines alive. But in 2022, that promise nearly collapsed. During training on California's rugged coastline, multiple ACVs stalled in the surf zone. Engines choked, Vehicles listed. Troops scrambled to safety. For a corps that prided itself on storming hostile shores, the images were humiliating. Billions had been invested, and yet the Marines still couldn't trust their new warhorse to cross the waves. The commandant ordered an immediate suspension. All ACV surf zone operations were halted. No beach landings, no wave training, no ocean confidence. For months, the vehicles were limited to calm waters only. The announcement sent a shockwave through the ranks. Critics outside the Corps mocked the program as another Pentagon boondoggle. If the ACV couldn't handle surf, how could it ever handle war? Inside the Corps, frustration turned into doubt. Young Marines asked whether they were safer on foot than inside a brand new vehicle. Veterans whispered that the AAV-7, for all its flaws, at least got them ashore. The surf zone failures became a public stain on the ACV's reputation. The emotional toll was real, confidence shaken, pride wounded, and yet, the Marines couldn't walk away. Too much money, too much time, too much survival depended on making the ACV work. Engineers went back to the drawing board. Training requirements were rewritten. Procedures for waterborne entry were overhauled. The Corps had no choice but to adapt, fix, and push the ACV back into the fight. But could the Marines truly fix a vehicle that had already stumbled in the waves? By 2024, the amphibious combat vehicle stood at a crossroads. Billions had been spent, but its failures in the surf still haunted the Corps. The Marines needed more than promises. They needed proof. The answer came in the form of a new codex. It was called AATOPS, Amphibious Assault Vehicle Tactical Operating Procedures, a rulebook carved from past mistakes. Inside were new training gates. No crew could take an ACV into the water without passing every single requirement. Hardware fixes reinforced engines, bilge pumps, and flotation systems. Extra safety layers were built in. Redundant comms, stricter limits, emergency drills. The lessons were written in blood, but they were not forgotten. For Marines, confidence began to return. The ACV was no longer a shaky prototype. It was being forged into a true combat system. Crews who once doubted now spoke of trust. Where there was once silence in the surf, there was now the roar of engines charging back into the sea. The emotional shift was powerful. The Corps had turned tragedy into discipline, failure into doctrine, doubt into a renewed sense of strength. And then came the twist. The ACV wasn't just patched up, it was now combat ready. What began as an experiment had been reshaped into a frontline weapon. But questions still remained. Would this new codex hold when the waves grew higher? Would the fixes endure under fire in the Pacific? The true test wasn't in training, it was in the wars that could come next. By late 2024, the Marines were ready to take the amphibious combat vehicle out of the lab and into the ocean. The 15th Marine Expeditionary Unit became the first to deploy the ACV into the Pacific. It was a proving ground where steel meets saltwater. In December 2024, off the coast of Okinawa, the ACV made its first open water movement. Engines roared. Waves crashed. Marines braced inside. For the first time since the death of the AAV-7, U.S. Marines stormed a beach from sea to shore. The moment was symbolic, confidence restored. For the Corps, it wasn't just about tactics. It was about reclaiming an identity that had nearly drowned in 2020. Marines stood taller, knowing their new vehicle could finally do what it was built to do. The emotional impact was raw. Young Marines spoke of trust. Veterans whispered of pride. The Corps had found its sea legs once again, but victory was only partial. The ACV had proven it could swim, but could it truly fight? Its armor was strong, its electronics modern, its mobility impressive. But without teeth, it was still just a delivery truck. War planners in the Indo-Pacific demanded more. They wanted a vehicle that could not only carry Marines ashore, but also destroy the threats that awaited them. Missiles, drones, enemy armor. The battlefield was evolving faster than tradition, and the question sharpened like a blade. What weapons would transform the ACV from a swimming carrier into a shock that could stun the world? By 2025, the Marines were done waiting. The amphibious combat vehicle wasn't just a carrier anymore, it was about to get its teeth. Production began on the ACV-30, the long-awaited gunned variant. At its heart, a 30mm cannon, stabilized, precise, and deadly against armored targets and fortified positions. For decades, Marines inside the old AAV-7 had been nothing but passengers. Now they were warriors who carried their own firepower ashore. The ACV-30 gave squads a weapon that could chew through walls, tear into bunkers, and strike moving vehicles before they could respond. The symbolism was clear. The Marines weren't just riding to the fight, they were bringing the fight with them. In exercises, the new variant spat fire across ranges, hitting targets at distances the old vehicles could never reach. It wasn't just louder, it was more accurate, more versatile, and more lethal. Enemies watching from across the Pacific suddenly saw a new threat rising from the surf. It wasn't only infantry storming beaches anymore. It was armored fire support, missiles, and mobile cannons landing in waves of steel. The battlefield had shifted. One amphibious assault could now deliver not only Marines, but also their own armored shield and heavy punch. The ACV had become more than a taxi. It was a moving fortress that carried both men and weapons into the kill zone. But war was changing too. Precision fire wasn't enough. The next threat wasn't hiding in bunkers. It was circling above in swarms, drones, missiles, overhead hunters. Could the ACV survive in an age where the skies themselves were filled with silent killers? The ACV was never meant to be just another ride to the beach. It was built to survive what killed its ancestors. The hull was carved into a sharp V shape, forcing blasts downward, away from the Marines inside. Seats were no longer benches bolted to thin armor. They were blast attenuating, designed to absorb shock, to keep spines and limbs intact after hits that once meant certain death. For the first time in decades, every squad stepping inside felt a new confidence. They weren't gambling their lives on luck anymore. They had protection that matched the era of IEDs and hidden mines. But survivability was only the beginning. The ACV wasn't locked to a single form. It was built modular, a platform ready for upgrades the moment threats evolved. Plans already showed active protection systems, intercepting incoming missiles before impact. Designs called for unmanned teaming, with drones scouting ahead, spotting ambushes, and feeding targets back into the ACV's brain. Every armored wave wasn't just muscle. It was now plugged into a kill web. Radars, sensors, and satellite data could pour directly into the ACV, letting Marines fight with eyes and ears far beyond their line of sight. This was no longer about crossing an ocean and landing on a beach. This was about linking squads into the digital battlefield, where every soldier, every jet, every ship shared one network of war. And that's when the world finally understood. The ACV was not just a machine, it was a node, a piece of a larger system that made the Marines deadlier than ever before. So what is the real shocking reason this vehicle has the world's attention? The ACV was never about speed, it was about strategy. For decades, amphibious assault meant pushing one armored column straight to the beach. Now, that doctrine is dead. The ACV shattered it by turning every landing into distributed warfare. No longer does one ship, one wave, one beach carry the burden. For enemies, it is not one armored vehicle to target. It is an invisible system, dozens of nodes, each one calling the others. Destroy one, and two more respond with missiles, cannons, or counter drones. This is the real shock. The ACV didn't just replace an old machine. It redefined how the Marines fight wars. And for rivals, that means one thing. Every beach has now become a trap. So what ultimate realization does the world face after the ACV's arrival? The real shock of the ACV was never about speed. It was about rewiring war itself. For the first time in decades, the Marines proved they could storm any beach again. This time not alone, but as part of a kill web. Every vehicle became a sensor, every squad a node, every landing a joint strike with ships, drones, and jets all linked together. The old doctrine of armored waves crashing ashore was dead. In its place stood a system built on survival and digital firepower. Enemies could no longer track a single assault. They faced dozens of targets, all connected, all ready to fire back in seconds. The twist was clear. The Marines didn't just land. They landed as part of a 21st century battle network. After years of doubt, they had reinvented amphibious war. And this is why the US Marines' new combat vehicle shocked the world. If one vehicle can shatter old doctrine, what other truths of modern war are about to fall? From the tragedy of 2020 to the triumph of 2025, the ACV became the Marines' redemption. What began with the drowning of 9 Marines turned into a machine that could survive, fight, and command the modern battlefield. We trace the death of the AAV-7, the Surf Zone crisis, the Pacific debut, the gunned variant, and finally the hidden strategy that rewired amphibious war. The world now watches every launch, every landing, every test, because this is more than a vehicle. It is a signal of how the Marines will fight tomorrow's wars. Subscribe for more untold stories. Do you think the ACV is unstoppable, or will rivals expose its weakness?